The year 1893 had a way of settling deep into a person's bones. The cold in the high mountain towns wasn't just weather. It was something that felt alive, creeping through the wooden walls of cabins and the thin gaps beneath doors, whispering old stories into the cracks of people's lives. Most of the towns scattered along the Rocky Mountain range were small, stubborn pockets of hope, surrounded by endless trees and silent ridges. People lived simple, quiet lives, built around hunting, trading, and surviving the kind of winters that turned breath into frost the moment it left the body. Back then, the mountains looked untouched, so wide and wild that it made you feel like a tiny thing. Snow covered most of the peaks even in the warmer months, and every trail was lined with thick pine trees that blocked out pieces of the sky. There were times when everything went still, too still, and even the animals kept quiet as if they sensed something they didn't want to speak of. That winter had been especially long, with strange storms that came out of nowhere, hitting the valleys with sudden force. People talked about it, wondering if it was a sign of something bad coming, but in a town used to hard years, no one pushed the thought too far. The hunters were the ones who felt it first. They were used to long days in the woods, to tracking animals in deep snow and reading the signs left behind. But something had shifted. The animals had been acting strange for months, herds splitting in odd directions, tracks that stopped for no reason, and sudden patches of silence where there should been noise. Folks brushed it off as the kind of mystery nature brings, but the worries never fully left their minds. At the center of these mountains, near a narrow valley that barely showed up on maps, lived a man who most people only knew by the hides he brought down to trade. He would show up every few weeks, sometimes after long gaps that made people wonder where he went, dragging behind him bundles of cured skin that didn't look like anything the locals had seen before. The fur was strange, too thick in some places, too thin in others. The colors didn't match the animals in that part of the mountains, and the patterns had a wrong look to them, like something that wasn't meant to exist. Buyers didn't ask questions. In those days, money and survival spoke louder than curiosity, and the man never gave more than a nod or a short answer to anyone who asked where he hunted. He was tall, with a face partly hidden by a rough beard and a deep scar running down the side of his jaw. His eyes were strange, calm but hollow, as if he carried thoughts he didn't plan to share. People kept their distance, partly out of respect and partly out of unease. He never caused trouble, never raised his voice, never acted in a way that called attention, but there was something off about him. Even children went quiet when he walked past, and dogs would growl low in their throats. Most of the time, he came and left without speaking to anyone besides the trader who bought his hides. His sled would creak under the weight of whatever he brought down, leaving deep marks in the snow behind him. Some of the men in town joked that he must found a pocket of strange animals somewhere up the ridge. Others said nothing, feeling a cold twist in their stomach that they didn't want to explain. On nights when he wasn't there, life in the town looked normal. The blacksmith stayed busy fixing wagon wheels and horseshoes. The innkeeper's wife cooked stew that filled the cold air with the smell of meat and onions. Parents washed their kids' hands before supper, and the small church bell rang on Sundays, calling people out of their cabins. Yet even in this quiet rhythm there were cracks, small ones that could be ignored if a person didn't look too close. There was the widow who kept hearing noises in the woods behind her house, soft footsteps that stopped when she turned. There was the young couple who fought behind closed doors, their voices low but tense. There was the sheriff, a tired man with a stiff shoulder and a past he didn't talk about, who had been noticing odd reports from nearby towns, missing animals, strange shadows seen late at night, and tracks that didn't match any creature he knew. He tried to calm people down, telling them the mountains always had mysteries, but even he didn't believe his own words fully. Everyone seemed to be carrying something hidden, some quiet fear or secret that gnawed at them. And the mountain man, with his strange hides and quiet ways, only fed those whispers further. No one knew where he lived exactly, only that it was somewhere deep in the forest where the trails thinned and the trees grew older. Some said he stayed near the frozen lake that hunters avoided. Others thought he lived in a cave he had carved into a home. Stories built around him without his help, filling the gaps he never spoke about. Still, he was just part of the background, a strange part, but not enough to break the quiet world people had built for themselves. Not yet. What no one realized was that the peace they believed they had was already cracking. The storm that had rolled over the mountains wasn't just weather. It was a warning, one that nobody took seriously. And the hides the mountain man brought down, they were the first sign that something was very wrong. Something that didn't belong in those woods, something that had already stepped too close. A world can stay calm for a long time, pretending nothing is wrong. But the mountains have a way of holding secrets, and sometimes they let them slip out one piece at a time. The people in that quiet town had no idea how close they were to losing everything they thought they understood. The danger had already started moving, quiet and steady, from the shadows of the trees. As winter dragged on, the town settled into that restless stretch of cold where people started losing patience with both the weather and each other. Days felt shorter, nights felt heavier, and even small problems grew sharp edges. It was during this time that the mountain man began coming down more often. Not by much, but enough for people to notice, and enough for the sheriff to start paying closer attention. Every trip he made carried a new bundle of hides that looked even stranger than the last. The colors were darker, the texture rougher, and some of them had cuts and marks that didn't match the careful hand of a hunter. People whispered behind his back, sharing stories that made him sound more like a warning than a person. Some said he had been seen watching the town from the tree line on nights when he wasn't supposed to be anywhere near. Others said he had been heard talking to himself deep in the woods. None of this was confirmed, of course, but the rumor mill didn't need proof to keep spinning. And the more people talked, the more uneasy they became about him. The sheriff, meanwhile, felt a growing pull to figure out who the man really was. It wasn't just the hides anymore. It was the feeling that the man knew something or was hiding something that nobody else could see. The sheriff tried to ask questions during one of the trades, but the mountain man barely said a word. He only gave a thin, tired smile and kept his eyes lowered, as if afraid someone might see inside them. That kind of behavior didn't sit right with the sheriff. When someone went out of their way to avoid being understood, there was almost always a reason. At the same time, other pressures were building around the town. Food supplies were running low because the storms had been worse than expected. The blacksmith was late on several orders, which angered the ranchers. The widow had grown so nervous about the noises behind her home that she refused to go outside at night. Parents kept their children close, and a few families were quietly making plans to leave in the spring if things didn't improve. People didn't say it out loud, but everyone felt like something was coming toward them, slow and steady, like footsteps crunching through snow. The trader who bought the hides, Reed, was dealing with problems of his own. He was in debt, though he pretended everything was fine. His business had taken a bad turn after two of his biggest clients in a nearby town stopped buying from him. He'd been leaning heavily on whatever the mountain man brought down, even though the hides were becoming harder to sell. Told himself that as long as they brought in money, he didn't need to question where they came from. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, and the wind tapped against the windows, he wondered if he was getting wrapped up in something he didn't understand. Also had a growing obsession with the mountain man's quiet, distant nature. He wanted to know what was behind the man's silence, what kind of life he had in those deep woods. Convinced himself it was simple curiosity, but deep down he felt something closer to envy. The mountain man seemed free from the town's problems, free from debt, gossip, and judgment. On the other hand, was trapped in a life he couldn't control. The more he thought about the man living alone in the forest, answering to no one, the more jealous he became. That jealousy grew sharp over time, like a blade he kept hidden behind a smile. The sheriff noticed acting strangely, too, had become jumpy, more defensive, and quicker to anger. He didn't like anyone asking questions about the hides, and he became irritated whenever the mountain man came into town without warning. The sheriff suspected that was hiding something, but with the storm-filled season, he didn't have the time to push the issue. Still, the unease stayed in the back of his mind. Meanwhile, the townspeople weren't the only ones dealing with pressure. The mountain man himself was changing, not where anyone could see, but in the quiet spaces where a person's thoughts grow heavy. He had started sleeping less, staying awake for long hours listening to the trees outside his cabin creak and shift under the weight of snow. He felt watched, though he could never find the source. And worse, he had been seeing tracks around his cabin that didn't belong to any animal he knew. Large tracks with a shape that looked wrong, almost like a twisted version of something familiar. He kept this fear to himself. He had lived too long with judgment and misunderstanding to trust anyone with what he was dealing with. The scars on his face, the ones that ran from his jaw to his ear, were part of a past he didn't want to revisit. They were reminders of people who had once tried to control him, use him, and force him into a life he didn't want. The mountains were supposed to be his escape, the one place where no one could reach him. But now it felt like the mountain was pushing something back toward him, something he couldn't outrun. There was another man in town who played a quiet part in all of this, a trapper named Lowell Hart. He knew the woods better than anyone besides the mountain man. Lowell had lived a hard life, filled with mistakes and forgotten promises. He carried guilt the way other people carried tools, heavy and hidden but always there. Years ago, he had been close to the mountain man, closer than he ever admitted, until a disagreement drove them apart. They had once worked together, sharing traps and hunting grounds. But something happened between them, something only they understood, and they went their separate ways. Lowell had kept quiet about their past, never mentioning it to anyone. Yet as the mountain man's visits grew more frequent, Lowell felt old tensions waking up. He started paying attention to the trails again, following tracks and signs he hadn't cared about in years. What he saw frightened him. He found patches of ground torn up, trees clawed deep enough to splinter, and those same twisted tracks the mountain man had noticed. When he tried to tell the sheriff, he couldn't bring himself to say everything. Some secrets felt too tangled to speak aloud. As the weeks went on, tension crackled through the town like the thin ice on the river that could break at any moment. Started drinking more, losing control of his temper. The sheriff felt trapped between the growing fear in town and the lack of answers. Lowell kept finding signs in the woods that made his stomach sink. And the mountain man felt a weight on his mind, like something was dragging him toward a fate he couldn't avoid. Then came the night that changed everything, the night when followed the mountain man back into the woods. It wasn't planned. It was something he did in a fit of anger and desperation. He had been arguing with a client earlier, had been laughed at, had been called too dependent on that high dealer up the mountain. The words stuck in his head, fueling every step he took as he trailed behind the lone figure disappearing into the dark. Snow fell in thick flakes that night, filling the woods with an eerie silence. Kept his distance, but he couldn't stop watching. And that was when he saw something move behind the trees, something larger than a man, moving with a strange, unnatural rhythm. He froze, breath held tight in his chest, trying to understand what he was looking at. But before he could think, the mountain man turned around, hearing something didn't. Their eyes met for the first time without the noise of the town around them, and in that moment felt a fear he didn't expect. The mountain man looked tired, worn down, but his eyes carried something darker, something couldn't name. The snow kept falling, something crashed in the distance, stepped back. The mountain man took a step forward. Neither of them spoke, but both knew they had crossed into dangerous territory. By the time stumbled back into town hours later, he was shaking. He refused to talk about what he saw, brushing off questions with forced jokes. But the town could see the change in him. His fear clung to him like smoke, spreading to everyone around him. And deep in the mountains, where the wind ran between the trees like a warning, the thing that had been watching finally began to move closer. Whatever had been hidden was no longer staying in the shadows. The town was running out of time, and every relationship was unraveling, every secret rising to the surface. The breaking point was coming fast, faster than anyone was prepared for. The night the crime happened began with a cold so sharp it felt like the air itself could cut skin. The storms had been getting worse, coming down the mountains in angry waves, and that evening the snow fell in heavy sheets that swallowed up sound and light. It was the kind of night when no one should have been outside, but fear and desperation have a way of dragging people toward terrible choices. He spent the whole day packing inside his shop, unable to sit still. His hands shook when he tried to count money, and his thoughts tangled together until he couldn't tell fear from anger. Ever since he followed the mountain man into the woods, something in him had cracked. He couldn't get the image out of his mind, the strange creature he'd seen move between the trees, the look in the mountain man's eyes, the feeling that something was being hidden from him. He felt played with, humiliated, pushed into a corner. And now he believed the mountain man was responsible for everything wrong in his life, his debts, his failures, the fear spreading through town. It wasn't true, but fear doesn't care about truth once it sinks deep enough. Told himself he needed answers, that he needed to confront the man, to force him to explain the hides and the tracks and the strange thing in the woods. But beneath all that was chasing something else, control. Control over the fear eating at him. Control over a life slipping out of his hands. He waited until nightfall before grabbing his coat and lantern. The storm had already swallowed the sky, and the wind pushed against him as he walked through the trees. Every step he took felt like a dare. He kept whispering to himself that he wasn't afraid, even though he was. Afraid of the mountain man, afraid of what he'd seen, afraid of what the truth might be. At the same time, miles deeper into the forest, the mountain man sat inside his cabin listening to the wind rattle the shutters. His fire was low, glowing faintly against the log walls. The cabin was small, barely more than a single room with a few tools, dried meat hanging near the ceiling, and a cot covered in blankets. He had been awake for hours, unable to rest. Something had been moving closer to his home all day. He felt it in the ground, in the way the forest went silent. The tracks he'd been finding were getting clearer, closer, more confident. He wasn't scared for himself. He was scared for the town. He knew what lived in those woods, what had followed him years ago, what had marked him and left the scars he covered with hair and silence. He had tried to stay away from everyone so his past wouldn't catch up with them, but he knew now that the distance wasn't enough. He stood and pulled on his coat, ready to head out and try one last time to draw the creature away from the valley. But before he could step outside, he noticed a lantern flickering through the blowing snow. Someone was coming, fast and reckless. The mountain man stepped back from the window, his jaw tightening when he saw who it was. The worst person to be near him tonight. Didn't slow down. He pushed through the storm until he reached the door and hit it with his fist. He wasn't thinking clearly. The fear had twisted into pure panic. When the mountain man opened the door, the wind blew snow into the cabin, carrying the sharp smell of pine and something else, something metallic and wrong. Pushed inside, shouting over the storm, his voice cracked with anger and something close to despair. "Tell me what's out there," he yelled. "Tell me what those hides are from. Tell me what you're hiding." The mountain man closed the door behind him and tried to remain calm, but he could feel the wrongness pressing in from the forest. He knew had terrible timing, but he also knew the man was breaking under his own fears. "You shouldn't be here," the mountain man said quietly. "You need to leave now." But wasn't listening. His eyes were wide, almost wild. He stepped closer, shoving the mountain man's chest. "You're lying to all of us," said. "You bring down those hides like it's nothing, like you expect us to pretend they're normal. You're covering up something. I saw it. I saw that thing. And you're part of it." The mountain man looked down, trying to hold back frustration. He didn't want violence. He didn't want this man in his cabin, and he certainly didn't want to explain horrors wasn't ready to understand. But before he could speak, something outside screamed, a sound so sharp and deep it cut straight through the storm. Froze, his breath caught in his throat. The mountain man's face changed, the calm slipping into urgency. "Get away from the windows," he said. "Didn't move." The creature screamed again, closer this time. Heavy footsteps crushed through the snow, shaking the ground beneath them. Turned toward the noise, trembling. He wasn't prepared for this. He came here demanding answers, but now his fear drove him past reason. His hand went to the knife he'd brought without thinking. When the creature hit the side of the cabin, the wood groaned under the force. Snow was dumped from the roof, backed up, bumping into the table behind him. The mountain man grabbed his arm. "Put the knife down," he said. "You'll only make it worse." But heard nothing except the pounding of his own heartbeat. His fear had become something else, rage, panic, a trapped animal lashing out at the nearest threat. And to him, that threat wasn't outside. It was standing right in front of him. "You brought this here," shouted. "Whatever that is, it's because of you." The mountain man stepped forward, trying to take the knife from him, but snapped. He swung wildly, driven by blind terror. The blade grazed the mountain man's arm, tearing through his coat and skin. The mountain man jerked back, shocked more than hurt. Before he could react, the creature hit the cabin again, cracking the logs. Stumbled, and the lantern toppled, spilling fire across the wooden floor. Flames sparked instantly, licking at the dry wood. Panic swallowed the room. The creature roared outside, turned toward the fire, toward the mountain man, toward the cracking walls, unable to decide what to fear first. He lunged again, screaming something that didn't even sound like words anymore. The mountain man didn't want to hurt him. Even as the knife came at him, he tried to stop without violence. But instinct took over. He grabbed his wrist and shoved him back. Fell hard, hitting the corner of the table. The knife flew from his hand, clattering near the fire. Tried to stand, choking on smoke rising around them. The creature ripped into the wall. Wood split open. Snow blasted inside. A massive shape loomed through the hole, nothing like an animal had ever seen, nothing like anything that should exist. Dark fur matted with frozen mud. Long, twisted limbs, eyes that glowed with a sick, unnatural light. Screamed. The mountain man grabbed him, trying to pull him away from the opening, but fought him, swinging wildly, blinded by terror. In the struggle, slipped, falling forward into the creature's reach. The creature lunged. Everything happened in a blur. Snow pouring in, fire spreading across the floor, the mountain man shouting a warning, trying to scramble backward, his hands slipping on the burning wood. The creature struck him with one powerful swipe. Scream broke off as he was thrown against the wall. He crumpled to the ground, his body twisting unnaturally. Blood darkened the snow around him. The mountain man shouted his name, grabbing him, shaking him, but his eyes had already gone still. There was nothing left in them. For a moment everything froze, the fire crackling, the wind howling, the creature pulling back as if sensing the shift. The mountain man stared, its body, guilt crashing over him like a wave. He hadn't meant for this. He had tried to avoid this. Every effort he'd made to keep people away had failed. The creature snarled, stepping forward again. The mountain man forced himself up, grabbing the burning lantern and throwing it toward the hole in the wall. Fire hit the creature's face. It screamed, pulling back into the storm, retreating just long enough for the mountain man to drag's body out of the burning cabin. Snow swallowed them both as the flames behind them spread through the roof. The creature circled in the dark, growling, watching. The mountain man stood over still body, shivering with shock and loss. He knew he had to get help. He had to warn the town. But he also knew that when they found out had died here, inside his cabin, with a slash across his chest and fear on his face, they wouldn't believe the truth. They'd blame the man who lived alone in the woods, the man who brought down strange hides, the man everyone already feared. As the snow fell harder and the creature moved back into the shadows, the mountain man knelt by and whispered the words that had been stuck in his throat for years. "I'm sorry, I should told you." The storm swallowed his voice. The fire behind him roared, and in the distance the creature howled into the night, marking the beginning of a terror that would soon reach the town. By the time the storm eased and the sun pushed a weak, pale light across the snow-covered valley, the mountain man had already been walking for hours. His legs burned with exhaustion, and his fingers were stiff from the cold. But he kept going, dragging his body behind him on a makeshift sled made from broken pieces of his cabin door. The fire had taken most of the structure by the time he escaped. All that was left now was a pile of charred logs still letting off smoke into the morning air. He didn't look back, he couldn't. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him heavily than the snow. Was gone, and even though the mountain man knew the creature had killed him, that didn't ease the guilt twisting in his chest. Had come there because he feared the truth the mountain man had kept hidden too long. Truth that should have been spoken before the creature got bold enough to come this close. When he finally reached the edge of town, the morning was still quiet. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, and no one had stepped outside yet. The world looked peaceful, untouched, and he hated himself for bringing the violence of the mountains into it. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office, took one long breath, and banged on the door. Sheriff Hale opened it with a tired look on his face, rubbing sleep from his eyes. But when he saw the mountain man standing there, soaked with melted snow, covered in ash, blood splattered across his coat, his expression shifted from groggy confusion to alarm. Then he saw the body on the sled and the color drained from his face. "What happened?" Hale asked, voice rough, not yet ready for the answer. The mountain man just shook his head. "It was in the woods," he said quietly. "It came for us." Those few words were enough to send Hale into action. Within minutes, a handful of townspeople gathered in the snow, whispering among themselves when they recognized. Some covered their mouths. Some cursed under their breath. Others stared with wide, guilty eyes because many of them had fueled the rumors that pushed to confront the mountain man in the first place. But shock didn't stay the strongest emotion for long. Fear crept in quickly, followed by suspicion. People looked at its body, then at the mountain man, and then at the deep slash across the dead man's chest. It wasn't the kind of wound anyone in town knew how to explain. The mountain man tried to explain that it wasn't him, that something had followed him from the forest, something that had been stalking them for weeks, but every word he spoke only made the crowd grow stiffer. His voice shook. He knew he sounded desperate, maybe even unhinged. The truth always sounded like madness when people weren't ready for it. Hale stepped between the mountain man and the crowd, trying to keep control. He ordered everyone to back away while he took the man inside for questioning. But the townspeople didn't scatter like they normally did. They lingered, whispering, glancing toward the forest every few seconds as if expecting something to emerge. Mothers clutched their children's hands. Men shifted uneasily, their eyes darting from the trees to the cabin of the man they never trusted. Inside the sheriff's office, the mountain man sat hunched in a chair, staring at the floor. His hands shook, not from cold, but from a mix of shock and guilt. Hale paced slowly, trying to stay calm. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. The mountain man explained everything. The creature, the hides, the strange tracks in the woods. Panic, the lantern tipping, the fire, and the moment the wall broke open. He spoke like someone who already knew he wouldn't be believed. When he finished, Hale leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He didn't call the man a liar, but he didn't agree with him either. Something haunted his eyes, not disbelief, but fear of what believing the story might mean. Outside's body was taken to the inn where his wife collapsed in tears when she saw him. Her cries echoed through the quiet town, cutting through the morning like a blade. People gathered around her, offering shaky comfort, but their eyes flicked constantly toward the mountains. The peace they had always depended on felt fragile now. Wasn't the strongest man in town, but he was one of them, and he had died in the place they trusted least, the woods. As news traveled, anger started to rise. The brothers were the first to shout what everyone else was thinking. "That man killed him," one yelled. "He dragged him out there, he brought the body back to look innocent." Others jumped in, some agreeing, some refusing to say anything at all. A few older folks remembered other strange events over the years. Missing animals, odd shadows, stories told in hushed tones, and suddenly everything wrong in the valley seemed connected to the man who lived alone in the mountains. Fear swelled until it turned into something sharper: blame. The mountain man felt the shift even from inside the office. It was in the way people stared through the windows, the way their whispers grew louder the longer he stayed. He wasn't surprised. He had always been the outsider, the quiet stranger who kept to himself. Now he was the perfect target for their grief. Hale tried to calm them, but even he could feel control slipping. The law didn't stand very tall against a town fueled by fear. Meanwhile, wife sat beside her husband's still body, her grief twisting into something just as painful as the wound he died from. She didn't know the truth, not the real truth, but she needed something to hold on to, and the easiest thing to hold was anger at the man had gone to confront. She convinced herself he had lured into danger, that he had lied to all of them, that he was the reason her husband would never come home again. Her pain spread through the community like a cold wind, reaching even those who had once defended the mountain man. Rumors began to grow. Some said the mountain man practiced strange rituals. Some claimed he had made a deal with whatever lived in the woods. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was fear and grief and the need for someone to blame. By evening, Hale knew he couldn't hold the mountain man in the office much longer, not because of the law, but because of the crowd outside. Their frustration had turned into a simmering anger. If he released the man, they would hunt him. If he kept him locked up, they would accuse Hale of protecting a murderer. Inside the office, the mountain man sat quietly, listening to the voices outside grow louder. He felt the weight of everything pressing in: the creature, the broken cabin's body, the guilt, the truth he'd kept hidden for too long. And worst of all, the knowledge that nobody was going to believe him. The only person who seemed unsure was Hale. He didn't trust the mountain man fully, but he didn't trust the crowd either. He paced back and forth, torn between duty and fear, unsure which path would cause less harm. By nightfall, the town was divided, some people demanding justice, others demanding caution. Everyone was afraid. The mountains no longer felt like old friends. They felt like something was watching them, waiting. And through all of this, the creature stayed hidden in the forest, its glowing eyes watching the lights of the town from the shadows of the trees, waiting for the next opening. The mountain man sensed it was still out there. Its death hadn't been enough to satisfy it. The aftermath of the crime didn't bring peace or closure. It brought suspicion, guilt, grief, and the beginning of a fear that would soon sweep over the whole valley, changing everything these people once believed about their safety, their neighbors, and the mountains they depended on. The town had always thought its worst dangers came from storms or hunger. But now they realized the darkest threat had been creeping just beyond the tree line, and they were nowhere near ready for what was coming next. The quiet that followed in the months and years afterward never felt like real peace. It was more like the land holding its breath, unsure if the worst had truly passed or if more darkness waited beneath the surface. The people who had been closest to the events, those who had watched the strange hides arrive, who had dealt with Elijah Crane, who had carried pieces of this story on their backs, found that the end of the crime was not the end of its wait. Justice did come, in the way the law defined it, but it did not come cleanly, and it did not come without leaving marks on everyone touched by it. Elijah's final days were spent behind iron bars, far from the mountains that had shaped his entire life. When he was sentenced, the courtroom was full, yet the silence was heavy. People had wanted answers, and in a way they got them, but hearing the details of what he had done, how long it had gone on, how many strange hides had passed through his hands, How many nights he had walked the woods looking for things he pretended not to understand, left the room colder than before. Some felt anger. Some felt pity. Others felt only a tired kind of acceptance, the kind that comes when a nightmare drags on too long. Elijah himself never showed much emotion. He did not cry or plead. He only watched the judge with the same dark calm he had worn through most of his life. But those who looked closer noticed something different in him as the trial stretched on. There were moments when his hands shook, moments where he seemed to drift far away, as if seeing memories he wished he could burn out of his own mind. Whether he finally understood the horror of what he'd helped create, or whether he simply feared the cage that would hold him, no one knew. But the man who once controlled a strange and secret trade lost the one thing he'd always relied on, his sense of power. Cooper tried to move on, but the sight of those hides, the strange feel of them under his hands, and the memory of Elijah's strange calm stayed with him. Friends noticed he talked less, as if words were too heavy. He no longer went to the mountains alone. He no longer trusted quiet nights. He walked through town with a stiffness that wasn't there before, as if expecting something to step out from behind every corner. People said he aged faster. That the crime had taken something invisible from him, something he couldn't get back. The townsfolk struggled too. For months, no one wanted to talk about the hides. For years, the story circled through homes in whispers. Parents told children to stay close. Hunters stuck to the lower slopes. Travelers passing through heard warnings that sounded like old ghost tales but were told with eyes too serious to ignore. Even if most people didn't understand where the hides had come from, they understood that something unnatural had touched their small corner of the world, and it made them wary of trusting what they couldn't see. Reporters from the cities arrived, hungry for details. They wrote about the strange hides, the mountain man who had collected them, and the isolated town that had been forced to face a horror no one could fully explain. Some stories mocked the people, calling them superstitious. Others tried to build legends out of what happened. But none of them captured what the townsfolk actually lived through, the slow fear, the doubt, the guilt that came from wondering how many signs they had ignored. Public opinion shifted from curiosity to disgust to something closer to dread, as if the case pointed to some weakness in society's understanding of danger. And the larger world reacted too. Law enforcement agencies talked about how things like this showed the gaps in communication between rural communities and the authorities. Church leaders spoke about it as an example of what happens when a man loses his moral center. Even scientists argued with each other over what the hides truly were, but the arguments never led to a clear answer. It left people uneasy, as if the world still held secrets far beyond what human beings could explain, and far beyond what laws could protect them from. Elijah's story became a warning about power, not the loud kind that comes from wealth or status, but the quiet kind that grows in hidden places. He had lived alone for so long that no one really questioned him. His knowledge of the mountains gave him control, and people trusted what he brought them because they assumed they understood the land as well as he did. That blind trust, that easy belief that nature would always make sense, allowed his secret to grow unchecked. It was a reminder that danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in small pieces, wrapped in routine, carried by someone who seems harmless until the truth spills out. The case also forced people to think about morality in ways that felt uncomfortable. Elijah claimed at times that he didn't know what he was dealing with. Other times, he hinted he knew too much. There were moments during the investigation where it seemed like he wanted to confess, and others where he acted like nothing unusual had ever happened. That wavering line between guilt and denial, awareness and ignorance, showed how easily a person could hide from their own conscience. And it pushed everyone to question how far someone might go before they become something they never meant to be. Some wondered whether Elijah deserved sympathy. Others said sympathy had no place in a crime like this. But almost everyone agreed that his life had been twisted by years of loneliness, poverty, and a hard upbringing that taught him to take what he could from the land, no matter the cost. That didn't excuse him, but it did make his story more complicated. It suggested that crime does not always root itself in pure malice. Sometimes it grows out of neglect, fear, pride, or desperation, things that can break a person long before they break the law. In the end, the town changed, slowly but deeply. People no longer looked at the mountains as untouched or innocent. They talked more openly about the things they feared. They relied less on the silence that had once made them feel safe. And while the case eventually faded from newspapers, it did not fade from memory. Every time someone passed the old trail where Elijah used to walk, they felt a small shiver. Every time a hunter dragged a deer down the slope, they remembered the hides that hadn't come from anything native. The land still stood tall and beautiful, but it no longer felt as simple as it once did. As for Elijah, he died in prison years later, far from the woods he once knew better than anyone. No family came to claim him. No grave was marked with his name. The story could have ended there, quietly, with a man whose choices destroyed him. But the truth was that the town carried his story long after he was gone. It lived in the questions people whispered, in the warnings they passed down, and in the uneasy feeling that some things in life remain unexplained. The crime forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily a person can lose themselves, how quickly trust can be broken, and how the line between survival and cruelty can blur in ways most people don't want to admit. It showed that justice can punish, but it can't erase what happened. It can't undo fear. It can't return innocence to a place that has seen too much. Still, in its own way, the story offered something like clarity. It reminded people that morality is fragile, that power can corrupt even the quietest soul, and that human behavior often hides layers no one expects. And as the years went on, the tale of the mountain man and the hides that didn't belong to any known creature settled into local history, not as a legend meant to thrill, but as a warning meant to teach. A reminder that the darkest secrets are often the ones we overlook, carried by people we think we understand, unfolding in places we believe are safe. The mountains stood unchanged, their peaks catching the same cold wind as always. But the people who lived beneath them were different now, more watchful, more aware of how thin the line is between the world we know and the one we fear. And maybe that was the real ending. Not justice in the way the courts defined it, not the death of the man who caused so much pain, but the quiet understanding that danger can grow in silence, and that it is up to all of us to listen more closely to the things we choose not to see.